Hey guys, welcome back. So now getting back into our talks about Immortal Hulk, and there's a lot that we gotta talk about, especially with this series finally tying into the future, which we've seen before with Black Panther and the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda, what we've seen with Thor in the War of Realms, and also with Jonathan Hickman's Powers of 10, which at this point is pretty much giving us a timeline of how it's all gonna go down. But before we get to that, we gotta catch up with some current day stuff. So if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so just jumping right back in where we left off, with Doc Samson having caught up with the Hulk shortly after Bushwhacker had shot Betty Ross, to where immediately after, in their search for Rick Jones, it's here that they discover that his body's missing. And so now prior to this point, we've talked about Shadow Base taking his body and what exactly their plans were for him, with them placing like an exoskeleton of the Abomination on top of the body of Rick Jones. But when this happened, I remember you guys asking like what happened to the Abomination, like how'd he die, how'd he come back, so I want to clear that up a bit as well. And so to do this properly, I gotta start with S.H.I.E.L.D. Volume 1 back in 2010, because it really feels like Marvel is taking these new things and tying them into a lot of issues which people just looked over. But back in 2010, Volume 1 of S.H.I.E.L.D., it gave us this narrative of S.H.I.E.L.D. being around for thousands of years. So what at the time, if I remember correctly, it was called like the Brotherhood of S.H.I.E.L.D., and it was pieced together whether it was powerful people or brilliant minds who would team up to stop world-ending threats and things of that nature. And at one point, Apocalypse was even a part of the Brotherhood of S.H.I.E.L.D., or at least he fought with them at one point. And I gotta say, I kind of feel like Jonathan Hickman is gonna tie that into what he's shown us already in House of X, with us also seeing Apocalypse saving the world from these invasions in Krakoa, which is one thing I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more about. But when this began back in early 2600 BC, this resistance was led by a great warrior named Imhotep, to whom in his honor the Brotherhood of S.H.I.E.L.D. was named after. And in this battle where they defeated the Brood, who had killed the Pharaoh at that time, Imhotep's victory in killing the Queen is really what set the stage and began the whole movement for this Brotherhood to begin, and naming the Brotherhood S.H.I.E.L.D. after his shield rather than the acronym abbreviation we know it for today. But even with doing this, and the bird which is on his shield, which at the time were actually in reference to Khonshu, and S.H.I.E.L.D. was just rocking it for years like whatever. But the way that this all comes back to the Abomination, who has seen a fair amount of deaths himself, but after being killed by the Red Hulk, General Ross, who had did this in retaliation for the Abomination playing his part in the death of Betty Ross. But after dying, he came back during the course of Chaos War, which is a pretty substantial event because I feel like it keeps coming back with Immortal Hulk. You have your John Proudstar references with Mr. Sinister and Powers of 10 and House of X. Like, it really feels like the Chaos King is gonna make a return at some point, but we'll save those thoughts for later on in this video. But at this time in Chaos War, when Abomination came back, and a lot of people were raised from the dead within Chaos War. But this run for the Abomination was shortly ended when he was killed by Marlo Chandler, the ex-wife of Rick Jones, who at one point in time was possessed by Lady Death, which is what gave her the power to be able to do so. And so now going from Incredible Hulks to Hulk Volume 3, the Brotherhood of S.H.I.E.L.D. put the Abomination back together and revived him by using Bruce Banner's blood. But even with doing so, the Abomination wasn't completely himself. But the reason why the Brotherhood had brought him back, it was mainly just to use him in order to retrieve the Hulk. But when this had happened, the Avengers stepped in, and Tony Stark had used some technology from the Brotherhood, which he had used against the Abomination, which teleported the Abomination to where Tony said he would guess was somewhere around Jupiter. And for some time, that's pretty much where much of his remains were just kind of floating. And that's where Shadow Base had retrieved the remains of the Abomination, which they had taken back to Shadow Base B to study and experiment bonded with Rick Jones. And so at this point in time, with the Hulk and Doc Samson, who had just discovered that Rick Jones' body was missing, which brings them both to Shadow Base A, which is where the Hulk believes that Rick Jones is located, because this is where the Hulk was taken when they chopped him up into pieces with the adamantium scalpel, which as a result didn't end well for anybody at Shadow Base A, which is why the place is already completely wrecked. And upon their arrival, they had to face off with all kind of Hulk experiments, which had turned out to really just be a tool to let General Fortean know that the Hulk was on to the whereabouts of Rick Jones. And so at this point, you have Jackie McGee, who's at the house where Betty was shot, speaking to investigators, trying to figure out what's going on. And it's here that Betty Ross reveals herself to Jackie in this new Harpy/Red Hulk form. And so now as for Hulk and Doc Samson, who at this point get separated because with them coming to Shadow Base A, it was more or less a trap, with Rick Jones actually being located at Shadow Base B. And this was something that General Fortean was counting on, one, to distract the Hulk, but also to bring him here so they can weaken him with sunlight so that Agent Burbank, aka Bushwhacker, could kill him, chop him up in little pieces, and just bring him to Shadow Base B. But with doing this, this gives us something pretty crazy for the first time, which we will see repeatedly throughout Immortal Hulk and even in Absolute Carnage, because at this time, this gives us us Joe Fixit the opportunity to make his way to the surface, but in the form of Bruce Banner. And he makes his way out of there by shading on a notepad where somebody had written the username and password on, which is really like one of your oldest tricks in the book. But he uses this to hack into the system and switch the lighting from ultraviolet wavelengths into gamma, which essentially bring back the stronger Hulk, and at one point what seemed to be more than one Hulk, like rising to the surface. But with Joe Fixit doing this, he literally fixed the situation and created the opportunity for the stronger Hulk to get them out of there. And so now jumping forward 8 days later after this, Banner's consciousness rises back to the surface to where he finds himself in the back of a cab wearing an outfit that Joe Fixit would wear, but just in a size that would fit Banner. But at this point in time, Joe Fixit pretty much sent Banner on a path with a couple clues, leaving Banner to figure out the rest. But all the while during this time, General Fortean has already bonded Rick Jones with the Abomination and sent him after the Hulk. But during this time while Bruce is figuring things out, we find that he's made a list of the different Hulks that have been surfacing lately and the ones that are missing, with it showing us that both himself and Joe Fixit both appear in the form of Bruce Banner, while in Hulk form you also have your Devil Hulk and your Savage/Childlike Hulk, which is shown up, but on your missing/dormant you're still missing Professor Hulk and also your Green Scar Hulk, who's also known as your World Breaker Hulk. And as we know, there are plenty more Hulks who need to go on this list, like there's Club from Axis, there's also your Doc Green Extremis Hulk, and I'm sure Banner was getting to the point of adding those to the list, but at this point in time we're being shown that not only are different Hulks appearing more frequently, but also that some are appearing in different manifestations, most notably with Joe Fixit recently making 2 appearances in the form of Bruce Banner. But in the middle of Banner having this conversation with the Immortal Hulk, they're met by Rick Jones within the Abomination exoskeleton, which mind you, the portion which is partially the Abomination, who was given a sample of Banner's blood, and even back at the time of his origin, back in Tales to Astonish, he received a high level of gamma radiation during one of Banner's experiments, which at the time in the late 60s, it made him stronger than Hulk in his initial transformation. And I mean, fast forward to now, Hulk is still strongest one there is, but I believe a lot of this history, it gives us some interesting terms to the outcome of this fight, because in addition to this, you also have Rick Jones, who's trying to fight this other part of him that's the Abomination, but this very combination is very much like science has perverted nature, with the way that these two are being forced to act as one. And so when he hits the Hulk with his digestive secretions, which is pretty much stomach acid, which for regular people is hydrochloric acid surrounded by a mucous membrane, but for Hulks, who knows? But when it makes contact with the Hulk, it breaks him down and he does not heal. And with doing so, it really doesn't kill him either, but rather it kind of just leaves him in this in-between state. And so at this point when Betty Ross and Jackie McGee arrive, Betty just rips out his heart and she eats it, which is on one hand exactly what General Fortean had wanted, but in the case of Betty, this was actually her helping the Hulk, who at this point in time was stuck in the point where he couldn't die, but at the same time he couldn't heal. And I gotta say that it's likely that this was possible in the first place because of the history of the Hulk's DNA being a part of the Abomination up to this point, because of what had taken place with the Brotherhood of S.H.I.E.L.D., who for the record is very separate from General Fortean and his resources at Shadow Base. And so now when this happens, we see Banner in the below place face to face with Brian Banner, and it's here that we find out through Brian Banner that this is where Bruce or any other Hulk comes every time that they die. And this is something as the reader we already knew, but with Brian explaining this to Bruce, it more so just solidifies what we've seen already in Immortal Hulk. But at this point in time with Bruce arriving here after his latest death, he's curious to know like if he really ever left here. And Brian explains to him that ever since the initial gamma explosion, Bruce has never truly left this place, because that initial gamma explosion was his first death, which unlocked a connection which was already in his blood. And as you guys know, because we talked about previously on this playlist, like the history with Brian Banner discovering the One Below All, to where he later learned that here is where all gamma radiation comes from, and even all the crazy ways that the One Below All is connected and is literally a part of gamma radiation on a molecular level. Like Brian Banner takes all of this and tries to give it to Bruce at one time, and it's a lot for him to take in, especially with Brian Banner telling him that he is himself and he's also the One Below All. But even still, as Brian Banner, he's stuck here in this place, yearning to return and bring the One Below All with him. And so with Bruce, who feels like, okay, you stuck here and you deserve to be stuck here alone. But the thing is, he's not alone. And just like that, for a brief moment, Bruce sees a glimpse of his mother, but then he's instantly snatched back to the land of the living once the Hulk reawakens. And much to the thanks of Betty killing him so that he could fully go through the resurrection process. But after returning back and taking down the Abomination with the help of Betty, and also fighting off General Fortean's men, the Hulk is then able to separate Rick Jones from the Abomination by literally just ripping him out, which is something he had time to do because of General Fortean pulling back his men at the arrival of Gamma Flight, who who at this point in time collected the remains of the Abomination and took them to the Alpha Flight space station. And I gotta tell you, man, like the remains of the Abomination, like they have been a place or two, like they get around. And so now from here, getting back to General Fortean, who had to pull back and leave essentially because he didn't want to expose Shadow Base with them having an altercation with Gamma Flight. And even though members of Gamma Flight already know of Shadow Base, if he were to go toe to toe with them, then they're gonna call in Alpha Flight, and then from Alpha Flight, Carol Danvers is gonna call the Avengers, and that's just gonna bring way more problems than he has the means and resources to deal with. But speaking of means and resources, we see General Fortean with his own Hulkbuster-like suit, gearing up to do a quick snatch and grab into the Alpha Flight space station, which isn't heavily populated, but he's doing so in order to retrieve the remains of the Abomination because he believes he can pilot it much better than Rick Jones, and then essentially use it to take down the Hulk. And so now with this technology, which is what I believe that they used to retrieve the remains of the Abomination back when Tony Stark sent the Abomination to Jupiter in a very violent dismantling way, but I believe it's the same technology that Shadow Base is using to send General Fortean to the Alpha Flight space station, much like how they retrieved the remains of the Abomination from Jupiter. But in this case, with it being a much more confined space, the risk is much higher, but he's willing to take it in order to win. And when he arrives, he just pops up on Titania and Absorbing Man, rendering them unconscious with tranquilizers that had a titanium needle delivery system in order to put them down and give him enough time to get what he came for. But when he came across Walter Langowski, he just tells him about a specific Sasquatch incident in Minnesota which left 4 dead, and because of this, General Fortean, he hits Walter Langowski with a lethal round. And when General Fortean does this, it's like he doesn't feel anything. Like to him, he doesn't even consider Langowski human, and he just calls in for Shadow Base to pick him up. He tells him there's no human casualties, and it's like Shadow Base, they know this guy. And so like when they respond, they're like, what do you mean no human casualties? Oh, what did you do? And it's like, I can imagine somebody with a headset just leaned over, covered the mic, and like, oh, he done shot somebody with powers, dog. Because they know this guy's track record, and they know that he's one that's willing to do whatever it takes. And not like Captain America's speech, whatever it takes, but I mean like blind leap after blind leap. Like, why did you kick the door down? It was unlocked type of guy, you know what I'm saying? But it's even got to the point to where one of his lead technicians, Dr. McGowan, who advised him to not to do the jump because it was too dangerous, and who had also advised him not to merge with the Abomination, but Fortean doesn't care, and he knows she's going to report him to the Pentagon. But aside from the Pentagon, he doesn't have to answer to anyone, and he knows because of the arrangement he has with the Pentagon that they'll greenlight pretty much any decision that he makes as long as he keeps it contained and there's no fingers pointing back to who's funding this organization. So when he's told that she's going to report him, he really doesn't care because he's still going to do what he believes needs to be done. And at this point, he's pretty much like, hey Alexa, play Lil Uzi Vert, because now I do what I want. And from here, he merges with the Abomination, which he successfully does, but it's like the riskiest, dumbest thing he's ever done. But with doing so, he immediately appears to have more control than Rick Jones, and mainly with him not fighting against the Abomination, but at this point definitely treading in an unknown territory. But even with doing this, he would swear to Dr. McGowan that he was absolutely in control, and that there was no need to run any extra tests, but rather he was ready to get out there and use this thing as a weapon, even though the snot blood dripping from his nose said otherwise. But back with the remaining members of Gamma Flight, who are still dealing with the recent death of Walter Langowski, aka Sasquatch, and at this point in time, it's like a week later from when he passed, and with him not waking up as of yet, they decide to put him in suspended animation. But this doesn't happen without much finger pointing at Doc Samson, and much of it is coming from Titania. Even though Puck is actually closer to Langowski, he's actually holding on to hope that Langowski will pull through. But with Titania, she's mad about getting shot with the needles that probably have morphine in them, and her husband Absorbing Man is like, nah, I've been clean for a while, but that was definitely morphine. That joke was no joke. Like, he's clearly relaying a little bit too much information. And so now from here, we go over to Jackie, Betty, Rick, and Bruce, to where at this point they're just moving and laying low in the motel, and all the while just kind of watching Rick Jones' body, hoping that he'll come back, with Betty keeping a close eye on him and Bruce right outside the door, and Jackie somewhere in the living room just bugging out. But at this point where Bruce comes to the door to speak to Betty, and she appears to him in her harpy form, and he asks her if she's able to turn back, and she tells him that he can, but even though she can, she tells him that she doesn't want to, and mainly because, much like she expressed a number of times but to Jackie prior to this point, she believes that this is the true her. But almost in the blink of an eye, Joe Fixit takes over Bruce, and he tells her that he likes the look, and he admits that he wishes he had some claws and feathers himself. But this really just feeds into that drastic difference between like your Immortal Hulk and Bruce and Joe Fixit, because your Green Hulk, who we've seen of late, he has much more in common and way better communication with Bruce than Joe Fixit. And we see a bit more of that when Joe Fixit goes to talk to Jackie McGee, because when he goes to speak to her, she actually asks him like, where do I stand with you, and meaning Joe Fixit, but mainly asking because she wants to know where she stands with all three of them, or at least the three that she's met to this point. And as this conversation leads outside, I do gotta mention, like, Joe Fixit is showing an improvement in his tolerance to UV rays, and of course part of that is with him coming out in Banner form, but even still it's almost like he's adapting with using Banner's body in this unorthodox way. But as far as what he tells Jackie, as far as Banner, himself, and the green guy, it's first that Banner doesn't like her, and it's probably because she wants to be a Hulk so bad, but with Banner not liking her, that scores points with Joe, who's really just getting to know her. And as far as the green guy, he likes her, mainly because though she's afraid of all of them, she's still able to confront them and speak her mind. But in the middle of this conversation, Rick Jones, bucket naked, just jumps out the bathtub glowing, and he's like, look, I know where they're at. And by them, of course, he's referring to General Fortean, because for Rick Jones, at this point, he remembers everything. And as a result of this, he's able to help Gamma Flight by giving them the exact location of the other shadow base where General Fortean is at this current moment. And because of that, they're like, okay, cool, so we just gonna drop in on him, he ain't gonna know what's coming, and it's gonna be a cakewalk because they have the element of surprise, and the only way he would know is unless he's psychic. And when they arrive, he's waiting because he literally has psychic surveillance around shadow base. And him and his team just standing there like, surprise, Gamma suckers, because he was alerted about their arrival, and so he knew the time and the location. But when this happens and he's looking at Doc Samson like one of those snotty-nosed kids who's always asking if you got games on your phone, it isn't much longer before this boom comes hitting on the wall, which at this point in time is none other than the Hulk, Betty, Jackie McGee, and Rick Jones, which at this point in time have increased their odds tremendously and pretty much prevented them from either getting detained or executed. And so now for Dr. McGowan and her team, who are just watching this on every screen like it's a DopeSpill video or something, they're soon met by the arrival of Rick Jones and the others. And I gotta tell you, when I seen this, I thought Rick Jones was just gonna pull something from Stephen King's Sleepwalkers or Thinner or something, and like pull her soul out through her face or something. But he didn't, and instead it just came to the point when they realized that much the way that Shadow Base was being operated was under the orders of General Fortean. And when he brought in Dr. McGowan and many of the others like the strike team and the other scientists, he had pulled them all out of a lot of bad situations, and he really had just used all of them to give them all some type of employment. And I'm gonna tell you, like, I couldn't have been Rick Jones, because I'd have been like, man, this is the only job you could have found? Like, I'm gonna look y'all up on Glassdoor and see what's really going on. But while they're having this conversation, and Dr. McGowan even expresses that General Fortean is a lost cause because he's just gone too far. And I don't think anybody from either side would argue with that. But with doing so, when he throws the stomach booger sauce on the Hulk, his face and his chest just slide off his body, and what's left of it he just starts throwing around at everybody. And I gotta tell you, it's one of those things that's gruesome, but it looks so good. Like, if only this was one of the moves that the Hulk would pull on a regular and like just call it FaceTime or something. Because if he did this on a regular, I'm sure there's plenty of people who just wouldn't mess with him. Because if he did that, they just be like, well, you know, we really don't gotta fight. Like this dude giving him the mean side eye and heading in the other direction like, look, I know I was in a bad situation before, but the Hulk acting like he want everybody to unlock his phone out here, and I don't want that passcode. And it's like, that dude, he made a good choice, but he followed it with a very bad one. Because when Fortean goes again at throwing up hypnotic and hand on everybody, at this point that same dude, he's clearly out of the way, which was a smart choice, but his fellow guards got hit with the sauce and they were just instantly deteriorated like Judgment Day. And Fortean, who really just saw it as like a casualty of war, which is a war that's raging in his own mind, but with doing so the Hulk takes him down, even though he hits the Hulk with it again. But it's really just reminds me of like those matches in a game where your opponent keeps doing the same move, and likely because they're new to the game, or in this case with Fortean being new to the suit and he just doesn't have as many tricks up his sleeve. But with going up against the Hulk, who proves he can improvise on top of improvise, he just finds himself outmatched, which wins him a first class ticket to the below place. And Brian Banner, tell us what our wonderful contestant has won. Okay, let me stop. But when he gets there, it's a huge eye opener, because he's like, man, like I didn't know y'all was getting down like this. And in a literal sense, like nobody's getting down lower than this. Like this is below all. But it's when he wakes up here, it's like we know, okay, now he's one of the Hulks, and he's either gonna be stuck here like Brian Banner, or he's gonna have some crazy resurrection where he's reborn in a new body of some type of Hulk form. And that we'll have to wait to see. But personally, I don't mind if like he was stuck there and there was a way that Brian Banner had used that as a loophole to get out. But the below place is still very new, and it'll be some time before we really know if that's one of the rules. But as for your boy, the one who was given the side eye and going the other way, he comes back to check on General Fortean. And because he came back, the Hulk just backhanded him and dude like instantly turned into a cinnamon roll. But after this happens and General Fortean is taken down for the foreseeable future, the Hulk then sits in General Fortean's Hulkbuster seat in a very Maestro type of way, but with doing so, the Hulk then takes over Shadow Base, putting to use General Fortean's former resources to himself, including Dr. McGowan and their scientists, to whom many of which just have a guilty conscience for everything they did to Rick and all the others they experimented on, which reminds me quite a bit of what we talked about on both the Weapon H playlist and also the Wolverine's playlist, with the leader working from Shadow Base in order to go after Weapon H, but also the new ordeal with Weapon H, who has his own base, which I'm pretty sure he's moved the location of at this point, but it really feels like these Hulks are upgrading big time. And speaking of Hulks upgrading big time, like skipping into the future, like getting to the future talk now. But at this point, at the end of time, we see the body of Bruce Banner standing over Mr. Immortal, who's not looking so immortal at the moment, but at this point in time when this happens, he's met by the sentience of the cosmos. And so now just to put this all in perspective, because it's easy to forget with everything that's going on right now, that 1,000 years in the future that we're still likely to see something similar to the Ascension or even year 100 of Powers of 10 because of the conflict between mutants and humans, which could never be destroyed before, at this point is likely only getting pushed back. So let's just say for argument's sake that comes back around in Morva's 10th lifetime following the conclusion of House of X, but of course playing out differently than what we have seen in Powers of 10. And so now from there, going 2,000 years into the future, don't forget we still have Black Panther and the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda, which we definitely need to get back into because it also has its connections with Shi'ar space, which was something that was very critical to the X-Men within Powers of 10. But as far as Black Panther, this is 2,000 years in the future. It is after the Ascension, which we'd seen in Powers of 10, and this future we're talking about with the Hulk takes place after that. And so now after this, we have everything that we talked about with the War of Realms, with Old King Thor, Wolverine eventually getting the Phoenix Force, and him fighting with Old King Thor, which going in order is after the Ascension, it's after Black Panther, after all of that, and it's within this future, or better at this point in time in the future, when Loki finally takes the Necro Sword from Ego, which is an amazing story the way that it came to that point. And I'll have the different playlists down in the description if you need to catch up on any of it. But after that, at least to my knowledge, it's supposed to be Franklin Richards and Galactus, who are the last ones here at the end of time. And at this point in the Immortal Hulk, this is the end of time. And as it appears, the two of them are already dead. And so now from here, just considering what we've talked about thus far within Silver Surfer Black, and also the events unfolding within Absolute Carnage, we really don't know how and when Null will reappear towards the end of time, or with the whole event of the Silver Surfer going back in time, if that has affected the present day or even the near futures that we've seen, making this present reality technically an alternate one that we never knew was alternate this entire time. But if I had to make my guesses on Null returning at any point in time, I would have to say that it will be most likely around the time that Loki returns with the Necro Sword, and Null will just reappear in order to take it back. But at this point in time in the future, where we see the sentience of the cosmos, it's very much like what we had seen with Galactus, which we also got a refresher on through Silver Surfer Black when his previous universe died and the sentience of the cosmos called him into the next one. And with us revisiting this within Immortal Hulk, we're given the comparison even with Bruce Banner and the Gamma incident turning him into the Hulk. And it could be just me, but it's like the explosion is representing the end of the universe, Banner from before is representing Gallon in his previous universe, and the end product being the Hulk is pretty similar to what we have now as Galactus. With Gallon being merged before the end of his universe, very similarly Banner was merged with more gamma radiation, which was already in his blood from birth, but the deeper exposure gave him a much deeper connection to the one below all. And so at this point, coming to the end of this universe, where it appears that all of this must be done again, we come to find out that the person standing here is not Bruce Banner, but rather this person who took out Mr. Immortal, who took out Franklin Richards and Galactus, and with them 2 billion years prior to this moment. And with doing so, rather than merging with the sentience of the cosmos, he consumes it. And I gotta tell you, like, if this is how it truly ends, like, man, that is dark. But even with the ending like this, I have my questions, of course, for like, where does Null fall within it? Where do the cosmic entities fall? Like, how significant were the great beasts of the north? Like, when it really came down to it? Because like the one below all is a lot of people. And even with that considered, what is to be said about the one above all? Man, like, it's a lot. And I can't even begin to imagine like where it goes from here. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and I'll just be checking out the comments below all and just see what y'all think. But let me know your thoughts, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.